Hello everyone, you've tuned into another segment of our Social Causes Fridays. I'm your host, that girl, Jenny Carousella. Thanks so much for joining us today. It is July 8th, 2022, and we're going through this book right here, Forces of Habit, Drugs in the Making of the Modern World by David T. Courtwright. We're in Chapter 3, Part 2. At any point in time you're consuming this content, I can only hope you're doing well. And as always, I apologize if I waste your time. So we're going over our second segment for Puzzlement of Distribution, understanding why certain controlled substances were cash crop worldwide commodities and while others remain more regional and local. So quick recap from the following week though. We did talk about the European distribution engine, undesirable cosmetic effects, logistical drawbacks, morale around the hallucinogens, and the Christianity aspect, coping with life and contaminated bread, the hellish lifestyle, and as the author quoted saying, plainly put, these were some people who could use a drink or a smoke. They went through some really, really hardships. So let me go ahead and talk about our three major talking points for our Part 2 segment. The future of regional plants, environmental consequences, and the geographic continuum drug use. Okay, so with segment 1, here we go. Let's just jump straight into it. So we talked a little bit about the past from last week from the first section of Chapter 3. Now, the future of regional and plant use. Countless reasons to explain why the substances became a global commodity. I can't speak, Lord help me. A global commodity, while others did not. So it was a combination of either time, luck, politics, elite preference, cultural bias, and even marital alliances, interestingly enough. But if a psychoactive plant is not a world commodity yet, it does not necessarily mean that things won't change and it won't in the future become one. Right now, betel, chewing, and kava are still expanding in growth and popularity across the world. So personally, I've never heard of it, but apparently, obviously, in other parts of the world, it's pretty popular. So the Mormons actually brought the Polynesians over, and they brought with them their culture of kava drinking. And I guess at one point in time, Utah had prosecuted its first DUI case involving kava drinking. But another example of why it's been able to continue spreading is the growth of roads in Papua New Guinea has helped spread this, this cash crop, as well as making more popular places such as kava bars. Never heard of it, but looking forward to possibly one day exploring that from reading this book, learning new things. So yes, certain drugs are still out there expanding. And also another way is the herbal supplement industry is another entry point. So on page 60, there's a quote that says, psychoactive substances such as St. John's wort, and I've never heard of this one, it's called ephedra, EPHEDRA, have become popular in North American and European markets. So, drawing on the German clinical research, marketers have pitched kava and other natural remedies as safe and effective alternatives. So, yes, safe and alternatives to drugs like Valium. I needed to emphasize that. So, very, very similar, but still controversial. So kava extract it is already available through mail and is poised to be the next hottest garlic, ginkgo, or ginseng, and that's espoused by one marketing vice president who makes that claim. So again, just a quick little recap. Sorry for all the little blunders, but we talked about last week's Chapter 3 first section, and then now we're talking about the future of regional plant use. So let's go ahead and transition to the second segment. All right. That's the first one right there. Give me one moment, please. Okay. All right, so segment 2, environmental consequences, the cost or the damage of drugs. It's oftentimes measured by personal disasters such as poor health, low mobility rates, car accidents, but actually the most serious and long-lasting effects are actually environmental, and something that I didn't even realize. So, quote on page 61, psychoactive revolution has accelerated the degradation of regional environments and the fortunes of human communities dependent on them through deforestation, soil exhaustion, erosion, chemical runoff, and weed and pest infestation. So the expansion of coca production destroyed millions of acres of primitive forests, like the Brazilian coffee expansion in the 19th century. Many forests, I guess they rise from wet deserts, it's called, land with thin soil base, which wears after infusion with ash from farmers when they burn the forest for coca. And then the producers move to the cleared lands, depleted of soil, so minus the forest covering, erodes with rainfall, resulting in flooding. And then the flooding causes mudslides, and then the mudslides causes the result of burying villages. So stash and burn cultivation of opium in Southeast Asia and Guatemala, and with cannabis in Colombia, also similar problems. And the processing of illicit drugs at site of production is also resulted in the waste of chemicals such as gasoline, sulfuric acid, ammonia, sodium and potassium carbonate, which is often dumped on the ground or put into water streams. So another risk factor right there is the contamination and damaging of the aquatic life. And waste from morphine extraction, same problem. So adding ecological insult to environmental injury, cocaine smugglers also traffic endangered jungle species, exporting them dead or alive. Very disturbing. So interesting observation that he makes in this book. Drug prohibition problem is not the extraction, but the lack of safeguards is really what the issue is, and lack of supervision with the waste management. But illicit drug crops are also very damaging too. So page 62, they talk about how tobacco quickly depletes soil of potash, calcium, and nitrogen. So changes in cultivation techniques. Here's another example. Back in the 1960s, they had this new species of coffee, Café Caturra, with rapid growth in the sun, but it required a lot more fertilizer, a lot more pesticides and herbicides. So it's better the greener alternative is to, shade grown coffee beans. So interestingly enough, let me see if I have some right here. Yeah, I just was reading this right here. It's a bag of coffee, and it says Rainforest Rescue, and it is shade grown approach to preserve the environment and makes deliciously rich coffee. So I don't know if you've ever heard of shade grown arbor, but specialty coffee. I just discovered that today. So as I'm going through the book, very, very interesting. But another environmental issue is the spread of what they call hitchhikers, or for example, the Argentine ant, a very aggressive agricultural pest that arrived in coffee bean shipments, and they found them in California up to New Orleans around 1891. So another danger, and this one again didn't even consider it, and I hope that a lot of people will make this realization of how the long-term effects of illicit drug use and how it affects communities and societies in the long run. I need to emphasize that this is why we're going through this book series and social causes. So replacing food production for cultivation of drug crops, and the Chinese were very sensitive to these effects. Very imperative and very important quote on page 64. Critics accuse the British American tobacco for foistering bright tobacco cultivation on hungry peasantry. Company officials themselves professed concern about the abandonment of soybeans, grain, and other food crops. So the deforestation, the pollution, and blight is still a problem, but the psychoactive revolution made it extremely worse. So botanist plants that offer human pleasures quickly dispersed over staple foods, plus draining soil, producing coca, opium, cannabis, offer little to no nutritional value. A gentleman by the name of A.H. Grimshaw, a 19th century physician and an opponent to tobacco, he identified some of the issues of the valuable family farmland that produced, and quoted saying, breadstuffs, wool, hemp, flax, ruined due to cultivation of tobacco. Another interesting detail that people don't really consider, which I do want to spend a little bit of time because the book didn't cover too much of it, but it says another morbid detail. A demographer might argue that with 500 million people less due to lower mortality rates, that this actually helped ease the environmental pressure due to relentless population expansion. And I don't know who Edward O. Wilson is, but he's quoted saying, a raging monster upon the land. Again, page 64. So I need to make a little side commentary, personal note, nothing to do with the book, but this is commentary, why we do this discussion. So the idea of overpopulation, yes, there's plenty of evidence of how it's destroying the world, the countries, civilizations, villages. We've gone through the history. It's very, very devastating. Another reason why it's very, very good to go on a small scale, having, instead of things being mass produced, smaller local things, smaller community efforts, not the mass expansion of the plantations. What we're kind of going through right now, studying the history of how many people were exploited for the love of vice at their own detriment, at their own deaths. Now we have a lot of people who are still enslaved to controlled substances, and the world and the environment is still suffering extensively. So I think this is a great time to really, really touch on some of these issues. I do not believe that the world is overpopulated. There are places that are clearly densely populated, but there's plenty of places for expansion, and this is a great opportunity again to learn the mistakes of the past and work towards literally a better future. And hopefully we can get into more discussions about this. But for that will conclude segment 2, and we're going to transition into segment 3, the geographic continuum of drug use. So I hope everyone can kind of follow me along with that. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be said about population, taking care of humanity, and giving people a reason or a purpose to live, nurturing everyone, and also always asking the question, why are people using drugs? A lot of it is unemployment and despair, and we already covered earlier, living in a hellish environment with contaminated bread. There's a lot of reasons why, but it's not... Personally, I'm not happy to hear that so many people are dying, and it's a good thing to save the environment. There's lots of forces at hand that have led people to be in terrible circumstances. They mention elite preference, and they're the ones that are kind of pushing the slaves to cultivate these things, these cash crops for other people's enjoyment. So that's part of the problem, but we'll save that for another day. Lots to be talked about, but like I said, let's go ahead and get on to segment 3, the geographic continuum of drug use. On page 65, quote, "The wider the use, the more extensive the environmental consequences. Notion of continuum implies that a drug can move, and the infrequency of the movement back towards isolation of a local region or local use indicates transcultural biological foundations of drug reinforcement. It also indicates how entrenched psychoactive commerce has become despite international efforts to control or prohibit it." So, I thought that was very profound. We can talk about how things are getting spread and things are getting moved, and then we can talk about some things are restricted, no movement. Very, very interesting. So, also on page 65, drug control, to borrow a Cold War analogy, is more about containing use than rolling it back. So, interesting though, synthetics in competition with natural production. So I want to do my best at pronouncing these words. Bear with me, please. So mescaline, mescaline versus MDMA or ecstasy. Nutmeg versus MDA, methylendoxamine amphetamine. Tried COT or QAT versus amphetamines. So plant drugs competing with chemicals that appear superior due to compactness, potency, cost, taste, or lack of. So the last reason why some plant drugs remain regional and not global cash crops, it's essentially they missed the historical window of the 15th century through the 19th. For whatever reason, if drugs didn't make it through due to logistics, poor storage, reducing the potency or, effectiveness of the controlled substances, if it was prohibited due to religious convictions, too much of a psychedelic, the Christians were like, no, we can't have that. Things like that. If any of those reasons took place within that time period, the window is pretty much closed. But the primary source over the last 100 years of the psychoactive novelty in synthetic drugs of big pharma. So page 66, and this will pretty much conclude today's segment. Psychiatry's biological turn and rise of psychopharmacology. The prescription of profitable new drugs to fine-tune mood and improve performance assure the continued introduction of clean synthetic alternatives to natural drugs. eventually those also finding their way to the drug underworld. So I believe we need to really have a good discussion, I think, one day to compare and contrast the natural drugs versus the synthetic pharmaceutical drugs. So it's a very, very short segment. I broke this chapter up into two. So let me just do a quick summary of the entire of chapter 3 to conclude our Social Causes Fridays, Forces of Habit, Drugs in the Making of the Modern World, the Puzzlement of Distribution, chapter 3. Okay, so first segment, we talked about the problems of distribution, the morale around it, and coping with life. So some of the issues altogether, we already talked about wine, spirits, tobacco, tea, chocolate, opium, morphine, cannabis, coca, cocaine, all global products, worldwide, traded cash crops, coca, special case. That one was a little bit held up, but it still became a global cash crop, and it's still very popular around the world today. Europeans made a lot of determinations of what was popular. They had the technology, they had the networking system, bookkeeping, and religious convictions, and then also undesirable cosmetic effects. They did not like the long-term use and how the users appeared, how it affected your health and appearance in the long run, but also definitely logistical drawbacks. Then we had the question of contaminated bread or using hallucinogenics. Was it appropriate? Are you going on a spiritual trip? Where does Jesus fit into that? A lot of the missionaries were not down with that because we don't want to go on a psychedelic trip. We just want to get a little bit of a change. So they accepted tobacco over peyote, for example. And then some people were experiencing problems because of ergot or ergot fungus, and that is capable of producing hallucination. It could have been poor diet, lack of nutritional, supplements, or nutritional deficiency, starvation can create similar effects. So, page 59, going backwards, it says coping drugs that did not entail hallucinogens would have been a greater value to the gentry who controlled peasant labor. So you have to take into account that the people who were controlling the plantations and were the people who were working, cultivating the fields and these cash crops, they didn't always have a choice what they wanted to use to cope with life, but a lot of these drugs were coping drugs for, as one guy, Camporossi, realized that there's the real value of Camporosi's work is that it underlines the dire utility of psychoactive substances helping peasants and workers cope with the lives lived on the verge of the unlivable. So reasons why people were on drugs. And then today we talked about the future of regional plant use, herbal supplements, environmental consequences, and the drawbacks of these, causing mudslides, depleting the land of nutrients, and replacing good, stable food crops for that of controlled substances and drugs, and how that affected families. And then geographic continuum of drug use. Now we're talking about natural drugs versus the synthetic ones for pharmacology in the psychiatric wards. So very, very interesting. So the puzzlement of distribution, there's still so much that needs to be said on this subject, but it's the best we can do. There's so many years, thousands of years of history that is trying to be compounded into this one book here. We still have a lot to cover, but next week we're going to take a break, do a little bit more commentary on social causes, what's going on in our modern day society. So, as always, at any point in time you're consuming this content, I can only hope you're doing well. I appreciate any person who's tuned in at any point. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, I'm your host, that girl, Jenny Kirisoa, and God's peace.